Leadership analysis of Hurricane Maria. Today, I am Emma Thomas, presenting with my partners Taylor DeLeon and Nicole Day. Next. So to first introduce what we are looking at here and the topic of the day, we're talking about Hurricane Maria primarily. Hurricane Maria was a powerful and devastating Category 5 hurricane that struck the Caribbean in September of 2017 and continued to affect the island throughout October of 2017 and beyond with its after effects. Hurricane Maria primarily impacted the Northwest Caribbean. Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico bared the brunt of its impact. The hurricane's extreme winds, heavy rainfall, and subsequent flooding caused extensive damage to Puerto Rico's already declining infrastructure, housing, and communities. This led to a humanitarian crisis throughout the island. The response and recovery efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria drew significant attention to issues related to disaster preparedness, response coordination, and the resilience of vulnerable regions in the face of disasters. Next slide.
Okay, so moving on to the description of the case, while looking at Hurricane Maria, there was a total of 17 hurricanes in 2017, which makes the hurricane season quite active. Hurricane Maria is listed as one of the top 5 hurricanes with the greatest cumulative damage during that time span. So while we're looking at Hurricane Maria and we're trying to hone in on the leadership and who truly made decisions during this time, you're going to first look at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. But if you dig more deeper, you're going to look towards the administrator of FEMA during that time, which is William Brockman Long. He goes by Brock Long. That is a decision maker in this time period. So what decision Brock has to make during these times is how to provide aid to Puerto Rico in a safe and timely manner. However, with the hurricane season being so prominent during this time and a hurricane occurring like a little more than a week beforehand, there is going to be some difficulty in not only Brock's leadership, but the ability for FEMA to make a decision during this time. So moving forward onto the decision maker objectives, we are going to look at what Brock truly had to focus on. So you're going to be looking at coordinating responses, providing assistance, supporting local efforts, assessing damage, public communication, coordinating logistics, and recovery and rebuilding.
On from looking at Brock Long and FEMA and the primary description of the case and the decision makers involved and what their goals were, we can now look at who the other important actors were and those objectives. So primarily, as Taylor already mentioned, FEMA was the coordinating federal government, was responsible for coordinating the federal government response to this incident, as well as all natural and man-made disasters. Brock Long, as previously mentioned, was the administrator of FEMA at this time, and as such, led the efforts of the agency to make these critical decisions. Essentially, the buck stopped with him. Looking at the environment of this decision-making process, this was, of course, a stressful and intense period of time, as all disasters and crises tend to be. As such, we have to look at specific measures of disaster impact, geographic challenges specific to Puerto Rico, and the limitation of resources to this particular situation. When we look at the specific opportunities and constraints that relate to this particular hurricane, we can see that there were several opportunities regarding coordination, collaboration, and several solutions. However, at the same time, constraints of allocation of resources and a lack of preparedness did become apparent. Next slide.
Okay, so following that, we will be analyzing the issue. What are the key issues, problems, questions that must be addressed or resolved in order to reach a final decision? First, we have resource allocation, which is how should available resources, meaning personnel, equipment, supplies, etc., how should those be allocated among the affected areas to ensure an effective response and minimize delays? Next is communication and coordination. How can communication and coordination be improved between federal, state, and local agencies to streamline response efforts and avoid confusion? An emergency response plan. What improvements can be made to the emergency response plan to address the unique challenges posed by a catastrophic event such as Hurricane Maria? Public health and safety. How can public health and safety be ensured, especially for Puerto Rico's vulnerable populations in the aftermath of the disaster? Infrastructure restoration. Which strategies should be employed to expedite the restoration of critical infrastructures, including power, water, and telecommunication services? And lastly, collaboration with local authorities. How can FEMA work more closely with local authorities and leverage their expertise and knowledge of the region to enhance response efforts? Continued, enhanced data collection. Gathering and utilizing real time data can help allocate resources more effectively, but it also requires a strong data infrastructure and analysis capabilities. A community based response. Empowering local communities to take an active role in disaster response and recovery can improve outcomes, but it requires training and capacity building efforts. International assistance. Seeking international assistance can bolster resources, but it raises questions about coordination and potential diplomatic considerations. Stronger communication protocols. Improved communication protocols between FEMA and local agencies can lead to a more efficient coordination, but it might require technological upgrades and extra training. Early evacuation plans. Implementing early evacuation plans for at risk populations can save lives, but it requires effective communication and transportation strategies that must be decided prior. The consequences of these alternative actions can vary. They could lead to a more efficient response and better outcomes, but they can also come with potential challenges and trade offs. For example, a stronger communication grid may require investments in technology, which Puerto Rico unfortunately does not have at the moment, while international assistance may involve navigating complex diplomatic processes. The decision maker must carefully evaluate these alternatives, considering their potential benefits, drawbacks, and feasibility within the existing context.
So, as we highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, we are looking at FEMA, but specifically in this instance, when we look at an individual scale and individual leadership, Administrator Long was the responsible party during Hurricane Maria. As such, when looking at decision maker leadership abilities, skills, and styles, we are going to focus on Administrator Long. So if we first take a look at the problems and issues that were at the core of Hurricane Maria as a case and evaluate the actions taken during this case to address the problems and issues, we first see and notice an inadequate preparedness. Essentially, there was a noticeable problem with the perceived lack of preparedness for the disaster of Hurricane Maria, particularly the magnitude of the hurricane that was not necessarily expected at the outset. FEMA's response appeared insufficient to meet the immediate needs of the population, and continuing on as assistance continued during the response and recovery periods, there were a lot of insufficiencies noted as well. Turning to the communication and coordination side of things, there were significant issues with coordination and communication between FEMA, local authorities, and other responding agencies, and this hindered the timely and efficient delivery of aid. We see several examples of this. For instance, some of the satellite phones deployed by FEMA for communication were not able to be used in the Caribbean based on the technology they had inserted. There were several issues between the Trump administration, FEMA, and certain leadership in Puerto Rico, particularly the mayor of San Juan. And additionally, we see coordination issues amongst both federal, state, local, and Commonwealth authorities. As a result of this, there was a lack of timely and efficient delivery of aid. Looking at resource allocations, there were also major challenges to effectively allocating resources to the most critical areas and populations in need. Again, this led to delays in assistance, particularly for those who were most vulnerable and critically needy. And finally, we see the response strategy that was employed by FEMA overall, particularly including decisions to delay sending a U.S. military hospital ship, issues related to the Jones Act, and the differences between Hurricane Maria's response and the prior response to Hurricane Harvey and other hurricanes on the mainland raised questions about the prioritization of needs in the Commonwealth versus the continental United States. Now, if we turn to look at leadership theories and styles, when we consider some common leadership theories, styles, and models, one that becomes apparent as applicable to this situation, and particularly Administrator Long's time at FEMA overall, is Trevino et al.'s moral person and moral manager theory and model. So in this, Trevino explains and explores, and as do the other authors, the difference between being a moral person and being a moral manager, and essentially the idea that to be an ethical leader, one needs to be both. They also include a model that describes how people fall on the spectrum as leaders if they lack or have one or the other of moral personhood or moral management. And in this case, we see that Administrator Long failed to be a moral person in several instances, particularly his misuse of government funds, property, and resources, and as such cannot be defined as an ethical leader. But he did examine some moral management skills, particularly in his overseeing the resignation of a human resources chief at FEMA who was accused of numerous instances of sexual harassment and other misuses of power. As such, you could see, based on the model provided by Trevino et al., that Administrator Long could be considered potentially a hypocritical leader or a weak leader or somewhere in between. During Long's term at FEMA, the model and theory developed by Trevino et al. Places him, as I said, between hypocritical leadership and weak leadership. Additionally, if we explore Long's performance during Hurricane Maria specifically, we see several instances and a strong leaning into the collaborative style of leadership, whereby Long relied on other entities and community outreach and capacity building. This had both positive and negatives to it, negatives being that it may have reduced focus on FEMA's responsibilities, and positives being that in the future, this could contribute to better resiliency for communities and other government entities. Next slide.
So now that we have explored all areas of the case, starting with who is a decision maker, what are the objectives, what are the decisions to be made, and an assessment of the leadership, we're moving on to recommendations for past resilience. So for the past, FEMA should have a plan in place that is to tailor the unique challenges posed from Puerto Rico, such as the island being a remote and isolated area and the poverty levels effects on its infrastructure and livelihood. An important thing to note is before Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico was in a very difficult economic state where they were already struggling. Therefore, when the hurricane caused so much damage, there was an increase of need and an increase for assistance, as they already had a struggling infrastructure and a struggling economy. An earlier evacuation plan should have been communicated prior. There was some plan through FEMA, as FEMA posted in their pre and post hurricane analysis, that they had prepared for the hurricane, but they had not made a cohesive evacuation plan that all residents knew and were aware of and were able to fully act on as the hurricane was occurring. And then with the influx of hurricanes that season, emergency management procedures and precautions should have been already increased beforehand to aid in the response and recovery efforts. When they were discovering that there was going to be a rapid hurricane season, as hurricanes are not always to be expected and not always known how the strength is, which Maria is a big key in that, there should have already been an increase of effort in response and recovery beforehand, which could have mitigated some of the difficulties that FEMA and Puerto Rico faced during this time. Next slide. Looking at the future and giving some future recommendations for future resilience in hurricanes such as this one would be to encourage the creation of emergency kits containing supplies such as food, water, and medication, communication devices, and other important items. The emergency kits and any emergency items getting to Puerto Rico, there was a limited amount of supply in Puerto Rico as a hurricane had hit the Virgin Islands prior to that. An important fact noted in the FEMA post-hurricane analysis is that in comparison to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico only had 274,000 meals and 25 generators, while the Virgin Islands had 1.3 million meals and 30 generators. Therefore, you can kind of see that there was not equal allocation of supplies across the board. Next would be implementing natural barriers from nature-made nature-based materials such as wetlands and coastal vegetation to serve as a barrier against surges and floods. And then the third would be investigating in the strengthening of infrastructure resilience, such as power, water, and communication systems that are able to help withstand the impact of a hurricane. Puerto Rico had such a struggling infrastructure prior to the hurricane that once a hurricane came through, their whole infrastructure was wiped out in such a short amount of time because it was already weakened and already suffering prior to the hurricane. So it would assist in the future to make sure that the strength of the infrastructure across the board, not just Puerto Rico, but across our nation as a whole. Therefore, if a disaster hits, the effect would be lessened. Next slide.
The aftermath. Oh. I'll take this one. It's okay.
Okay.
The aftermath of Hurricane Maria exemplifies the importance of natural disasters that play in evaluating the nation's emergency response and leadership capabilities. The result of this powerful Category 5 hurricane revealed strengths and weaknesses within disaster response systems, specifically in FEMA's lack of readiness and response under Brock Long's leadership. As FEMA worked closely with both state and local officials to handle damages and needs left behind by Maria, the difficulties of disaster management were demonstrated. Future disaster response plans must be strengthened and modified as a result of the lessons FEMA learned during this tough hurricane season. Emergency management systems must have a cohesive decision-making process with interagency coordination and efficient leadership. The effects of Hurricane Maria were devastating and stand as a reminder to continually improve disaster responses over time as climate change and natural disasters become an increased threat. Do you guys have anything you would like to add?
We would like to thank all of our guests for their time in taking to understand and attend this presentation, and we hope it has been a valuable resource and will help our guests better understand Hurricane Maria and the structures and contexts of natural disasters going forward. Thank you.